Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Most Merciful. I'd like to welcome you, dear viewers, to another in our series, Studies in Islam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. In this segment, we will be looking at the discipline of Tafseer. Tafseer meaning the interpretation and understanding of the Quran. Tafseer comes from an Arabic word, fassara yufassiru tafsira. Fassara, which means to explain or to clarify. And what we'll be looking at in this topic is different issues concerning the Quran. In order to explain it, it's good for us to understand its origin, to understand how it was compiled, the Quran, and to understand the various elements of the Quran, the different types of verses, the miraculous nature of the Quran. We'll be looking at also the methodology for interpreting the Quran to ensure that one doesn't fall into some mistaken ideas. You know, there is a way and a definite course by which one may properly interpret the Quran. So all of that we're looking at under the general heading of Tafseer. We will begin the study of Tafseer by looking at the era of the Prophet, what was the Quran in the era of the Prophet, and in the time which followed it. We look at the history basically of its compilation and use. Now, before looking at this in more depth, as I mentioned in our previous programs, this is a course of study. This is why we call it Studies in Islam. So for those of you who have wanted to do a course of studies in Islam and there just wasn't any opportunity, you are working, you're stuck at home, you're not able to get out, whatever, this course is for you. And for others who have studied also to refresh their knowledge, etc., etc., but especially for those of you who haven't had this opportunity. So I would like you to take it as a course of study, just as if you went to an institute or to a school or to a university, whatever, to make your studies. And you have periods, you have a class which you attend, you have to take your notes, and there is even a period of examination when the course ends. So I would suggest to you that you get a notebook and start to make notes. And the course material will be made available to you for those of you that wish it, that would like it. You can get this course material from my office in Sharjah, 06-5339-864. Or if you're calling internationally, it's 971-65339-864. The syllabus, course material, will be made available to you. And as we said, when the first stage of our studies ends in about 6 months' time, we will also have examinations for those who would like to be examined and receive some kind of certificate from us as indicating that one has completed this course. This will be also available to you. So please, those of you who would like to study, take this as a class. Get your notebook, make your notes. And you may write into the television, Sharjah Television, to me, Dr. Bilal Philips, name of the program, Studies in Islam, and the address, P.O. Box 111, Sharjah, and get any questions on the topic that we have covered answered. If something I've mentioned here is not clear, and then in our next episode, that question may be answered for you. We said we're now going to look at the compilation of the Quran. How was it put together? Was it a book revealed as a whole? No. The Quran was not revealed as a single text. We know that the Quran was revealed over a period of some 23 years, the 23 years of the prophethood of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And much of the Quran was revealed to deal with circumstances which arose during the life of the Prophet. May God's peace and blessing be upon him. Issues would arise and advice would come. It was conveyed to him by the angel Gabriel, and it was conveyed to him in the Arabic language. It is a miracle in and of itself, and we'll be looking at that in more depth. And it is used as a part of the daily prayers of a Muslim. What happened is that when the revelation began in the 40th year of the Prophet Muhammad's life, he first, as the verses of the Quran came to him, he first tried to repeat it as he heard it in order that he wouldn't forget it. So whilst Jibreel, angel Gabriel, was narrating to him or relating to him the Quranic verses, he would quickly repeat afterwards to ensure that it would stick in his mind. And when he was doing so, this was his attempt to make sure he wouldn't lose it, Allah then corrected him and said, no, you don't need to do this. We will make it firm in your heart. And we find in the 75th chapter of the Quran, verses 16 to 18, we find there Allah saying, لا تحرك به لسانك لتعجل به. Do not move your tongue hastily in order to learn it. إن علينا جمعه وقرآنه. Indeed, I will collect it and recite it. فإذا قرأناه فاتبع قرآنه. So when it is recited, follow its recital. So Allah then tells him no need to try to memorize it. Allah will protect it in your memory, in your heart, and ultimately in writing. Well, how would that writing take place when the Prophet, may God's peace and blessing be upon him, did not know how to read or write? Well, what the Prophet ﷺ did was that he gathered around him people, some of his companions, who knew how to read and write. And whenever he received any verses, he would relate it to them and they would write it down. And he would instruct them where to place the verses relative to each other. And this was in, of course, accordance with the instructions given to him by angel Gabriel. And they, the early followers, wrote down the Quran on whatever was available for them to write in those days. Of course, there was no paper. There was no paper available. So they wrote on what was commonly used in those days in that part of the world. They would write on the skins of, dried skins of animals, which were treated and dried. This was one of the best ways to record. It was also written on the shoulder blades of animals. They would choose, like the camel, which has a very large shoulder blade, almost the size of a slate, and they would write on it using chalk-like materials, or charcoal-like materials, that is. And they also wrote on wood, and they wrote on the boughs of the palm tree, because the bough, when you get a fresh, where the branch meets the trunk of the palm tree, it widens. It's quite wide. It can get quite wide. And that section, if it's cut off and it's relatively fresh, when you mark in it, that mark remains. there's an oxidation process takes place and it remains. So it becomes a good source of record which will remain. So they wrote down on whatever was available. You know, they even used slate-like material, stone, flat stones, etc. They wrote on them also. Besides that, the Prophet, may God's peace and blessing be upon him, used to recite various parts of the Quran in his congregational prayers. So all of his followers used to hear his recitation of the Quran. So they were hearing, listening, hearing, and learning through listening to him in the prayers. And of course, for us, we might think, well, how is one going to remember, you know, Quran, which was just said in a prayer? I mean, how do you retain that? How does that become a means of remembering? Well, of course, if you hear it repeated, you know, on more than one occasion, then it will tend to settle in the mind. And of course, if we consider our backgrounds as being from a writing culture, a culture where we write things and we don't memorize very much, then of course it will seem quite difficult. But if you think about the culture as being an oral culture, where people relied heavily on their memories, from childhood, children were trained to remember things, not to forget. They had to retain this information in their memories. Then we now have a different situation. We have people who can hear something once and it sticks in their mind. And of course, they hear it a second time, that is strongly reinforced. So memorization from merely hearing in prayer was something quite reasonable and quite practical, and many learned large sections of the Quran just through listening to it in prayer behind the Prophet, may God's peace and blessing be upon him. Furthermore, of course, whenever a person became a Muslim, they were taught certain basic elements from the Quran, because of course the basic prayer in Islam is the Fatiha. The first chapter of the Quran represents the basic element of the daily, 5 times daily prayers. So everybody had to learn this, and they would learn some portions of the Quran to go along with it. That's the norm for their day-to-day prayers. So they would sit with those who had more knowledge than themselves, and they would learn it so that they could carry on their day-to-day prayers. So all of the Muslims basically learned portions of the Quran from the time they became Muslims. Thirdly, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ used to encourage his companions to not only learn the Quran, but to teach it to others. And he was known for the well-known statement, خَيْرُكُمْ مَنْ تَعَلَّمَ الْقُرْآنَ وَعَلَّمَهُ. The best of you is the one who learns the Quran and teaches it to others. He stressed this, teaching it to others, passing it on. So his companions were strongly encouraged, because everyone sought to be the best, to learn the Quran and then to pass it on to others. So in this way we could say, 4 basic modes by which the Quran was preserved in the time of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. The first we refer to as the written method, where the Prophet would guide scribes, because he himself, we said, was not able to read or write. But he had scribes around him, amongst those who accepted Islam. He would have them record the material, the verses of the Quran, on whatever material was available. So we don't have a complete text here, we just have scattered elements being written by different scribes. They kept their own compilation of the material that came to them. And of course, some people joined Islam at different stages. So they wrote at later stages, maybe they didn't have stuff from the beginning. You know, others were there from the very beginning. And some had to leave, sometimes to go out on assignments. The Prophet ﷺ sent them out, you know, to govern areas or whatever. And so there would be gaps in their writing. So it was not all a complete text in the time of the Prophet ﷺ. That was one method. It was written. It was in the total writings, we would find the complete text. But as an individual, no individual had what could be considered one complete text. The second way, we said, was that the Prophet ﷺ used to recite the Quran regularly in his prayers so that people would be able to learn it just from hearing it in prayer. And we said because they were an oral culture, they were able to retain things even though they only heard it one time, something maybe very difficult for us who depend now on writing things down. Thirdly, everyone who entered Islam was taught the first chapter of the Quran and certain other portions of the Quran for recitation in their daily prayers. So everybody was being given a basic portion of the Quran or portions of the Quran in order to conduct their daily prayers. And fourthly, the companions of the Prophet, may God's peace and blessing be upon him, themselves, they did not, they were encouraged by the Prophet ﷺ to not only memorize it themselves, whether it is from the written text that they wrote down, or what they heard in the prayers, or what they learned when they first became Muslim. They were encouraged to learn as much as they could and to teach it to others. That this gave them a special status. The Prophet ﷺ had said that the best of them were those who did this. So of course all of his companions wanted to be the best that the Prophet ﷺ identified. So they strove very hard to learn as much of the Quran as possible and to teach it to others. So from the year 609, when revelation began, to the year 632, when the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ died, the Quran was preserved in this way. The Prophet, may God's peace and blessing be upon him, retained it in his memory and he conveyed it. It was written, it was learned, it was passed on. But at the time of his death, there was not a single complete compilation of the whole text. We'll stop at this point and continue to look at how did the text arise in our coming segment on Tafseer. Again, we'd like to thank you for being with us in this segment of our program, Studies in Islam. And we hope that you will continue to follow our program throughout the year and at least complete this initial course of studies, which we estimate should take us to the middle of the year. About 6 months we should complete a complete course. I bid you now farewell. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.